Okay, so that was Typographies
I'm just saying it
3.
makes a good camaraderie between composer and performer. I think.
Oh, we got SoundCloud talking to us too.
Oh,
Criticism and
that's great. Nope. Bye bye for now. Yo, so that was Typographies 3, your chamber concerto, no, your
Yeah.
piano
Piano
concerto
concerto.
for chamber orchestra. What was it?
Yeah,
Or
yeah,
ensemble? The Sleep
Was
Symphony.
it Sleep Symphony?
yeah. The dissertation. Yeah.
So this is our guest. This was music from our guest, Dr. Daniel Bassin, director of orchestras at Ideal Wild Arts, right?
Yeah.
Yep.
That's what you're doing right now.
Yeah.
But he's also a composer, conductor, trumpeter, and educator. In that order, that's how you have it in your Facebook, right?
It
Yeah.
depends what hat I'm wearing that day, but these are hats that really do, form this complementary relationship of being able to be an interpreter, of being able to help young artists find their voice, of being able to find sounds that I haven't heard yet but would like to, and so on. Yeah, so it's just so wonderful to be on the screen with you guys because we had such a wonderful run during our doctoral days there. It's kind of amazing for me still that concertino, that piano concerto is now had its 10th birthday last spring.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, been a doctor for
10-year-old pieces feel
We
new to
decide-
me. So
we decide
it's just like how it is. I'm like, oh, that 10 years doesn't feel that long ago.
Yeah, it is amazing how, in undergrad you can look at something from last semester, and you don't even know who that person was. And here, these memories of what we were able to do in that cohort are still very vivid for me, at least. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah.
forgot to say that you are also a human encyclopedia of, of music, of orchestral music, of repertoire music.
Mhm.
For me, it was really amazing how you could always come up with references to pieces after pieces after pieces. Was that because of you work at the library of the a New York orchestra, right?
Oh yeah, yes. So 5 amazing years with the American Symphony Orchestra, which is an orchestra that kind of prides itself on doing the stuff that no one else is doing. So yeah, I've been very lucky in that I've was about 12 years old, I think, when I played my first gig as a trumpeter. So there were all these different opportunities for playing in different ensembles, for studying at, at a high level with great teachers. And repertoire is something that I've just always been thirsty for. And, the ways in which the stories of these amazing geniuses, some fairly recently gone, others been gone for a long time. What they had to share is something that that's been this all-encompassing, experience as an artist and educator, as a practitioner, and as someone, helping others to fall in love with the art and to, like I said earlier, find their voice. So yeah, one for me. That kind of deep dive into as much of the rep as we can. It's always been part of who I am and what I do. And while we were there at the University of Buffalo and I was conducting that orchestra, things also changed a bit, where we were first kind of advocating for some repertoire that wasn't performed all that often. And then more recently, realizing that that there's a lot of work we can do to make sure the repertoire looks like the world around us. So, advocating for underrepresented voices and so on has also been a major part of the work I do. But yeah, it's just such a privilege to see you guys here, and I don't even know where we should start, but I'm excited to see where this conversation goes.
Yeah.
I will say that since you mentioned the UBSO, we could start with that. Like, how was that experience? I remember that you brought a lot of repertoire to that wasn't usually played by students of undergrad students. Are you also doing it at Idlewild Arts?
Yeah. So the work that I have here.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Idlewild Arts Academy is one of only 3 arts boarding high schools that we have in America. So Interlochen in Michigan and Walnut Hill in Massachusetts, and we're in Southern California, about a mile up a mountain, just outside of Palm Springs, and about 2 hours from either San Diego or LA, depending on traffic for LA. But here I'm working with secondary students, but they've come from all over the globe. They really are remarkable young artists who are on the verge of major careers. So it's a very different situation than at the University of Buffalo, where we were part of this cohort of composers, and we got to work with amazing practitioners and experts in contemporary music from around the world. But we didn't have a giant music department, to have 4 or 5 different orchestras, one of which is doing the Red of Spring and the other which is doing Mozart Prague. What we were able to do during that time, and Megan, I don't know your experience of remembering this, but I remember when you came in the composer cohort, and I'm like, hold on, we got a French horn player who's from the Chicagoland area. This is a person I need in this orchestra. So the UB Symphony was predominantly a non-major orchestra, which had, its own challenges about how you create the discipline and the sound of an orchestra, given people being pulled in so many different directions. And the idea of really kind of opening up the deep dive into repertoire, not just the wonderful canonic masterworks that kind of student orchestras need to play, but also to kind of get a better understanding of what the world was like for those composers who were writing. And sometimes that manifests in things like just, hey, this one amazing piece, Falstaff by Elgar, that is kind of an Elgar symphony. He had written an essay on it. It was one of his favorite pieces that he had written. And for whatever reason, it had never been played in the city of Buffalo. And that was during a year when I think it was the 450th anniversary of Shakespeare's birth. And we did all of these Shakespeare-inspired concerts. So there was the opportunity to kind of do that bit of advocacy. Oh, One of my lights died. Hey from the dark. But also one of the coolest things that we were able to do. Oh, that's not good. Hopefully that doesn't happen too many times during this. One of the coolest things we were able to do was was in the year 2013 when a friend of each of ours on the line here, the cellist TJ Borden, came in to do master's work.
Mhm.
An amazing advocate for contemporary music and just a blisteringly gifted cellist. And he was coming in right as the centenary for Ludoslawski was coming around in that year 2013.
Yeah. I was going to mention that piece. Yeah.
Yeah, it was one of the things that just the stars aligned. So it was exposure to an aesthetic, to even a time period in music that most non-major undergraduate, people who were majoring in electrical engineering, or pre-med, they're not going to get, anywhere near repertoire like that. That composer, Witold Ludoslawski, in my opinion, is one of the greatest symphonic composers of the second half of the 20th century. He really knew how to make the orchestra do new and novel things, and also a way to get the orchestra to just speak naturally. So yeah, it was the case in this particular concert that I don't know if there's other repertoire of his that orchestra would have been ready for, but the way in which the soloist kind of really held the line for that entire work. And also being in a college, when you have a college-aged soloist, it doesn't matter whether or not that person is a ridiculously high, a level achieving graduate music student, as TJ certainly was, and that the rest of the non-majors are trying to get in practice time when they can. When they're able to kind of identify, hey, this is one of our peers doing this thing, it makes it a little bit easier to move those mountains. But,
he's gone on and had a fantastic career, and he's continuing to have a fantastic career in cello, and particularly specializing in contemporary repertoire. And I think that piece to it just has an amazing complexity that orchestra was able to produce. I don't think it's a complexity almost like of a piece like Liggity Atmospheres or something, which would be without a piece would have been impossible to put together. It's so precise, and this had a way of kind of achieving that same level of sonic complexity with these more amateur players.
Yeah, that way that the micropolyphony with its absolute specificity, you're on this one quintuplet 30-second note or you're off. And then the way that Ludoslawski's implementation of that limited aleatory, where the conductor goes and gives a giant downbeat and everyone's in their own cell repeating it, individually. And it creates, like you said, these amazingly rich and dense textures that would require kind of a technical level of ensemble playing and individual achievement that we were just really lucky that work on that particular program. It is one of the highlights truly of my career as a pedagogue. One of the highlights is as an absolute fanboy of that composer. And the music of that time as well. So that was a lot of fun. We didn't get to, reach that far into the 20th century on the regular with a non-major student orchestra like that. But one other thing that was actually wonderful during that time, though, is we were able to work with James Romig. Where we had a piece of his on what was otherwise a Sibelius portrait concert. But it kind of, there were still students in the group who had played that Ludo concert, and it kind of, they helped to kind of hold out that torch of, we're going to do romantic repertoire, we're going to reach back into the Baroque and classical period, but there's nothing to be afraid of in music of the recent past and also music of our time. We were able to do a few reading sessions and some other things like that, but it really it was so rewarding to be part of a musical community and be able to, you know, flex this one, you know, skill set that I had from being in orchestras for, you know, such a long period of time. But then, yeah, having composer colleagues playing horn in the orchestra, having TJ, who not only was, you know, playing solos, you know, with the orchestra, but we were in a free jazz, although he didn't like that term, but I do, you know, contemporary improvisation. Go and then plus. And that really was something so additionally gratifying as I was going through the PhD composition work, because as I'd mentioned, you know, this act of interpreting, that's kind of where my compositional life began. I was just a trumpeter who loved playing in ensembles, and then I discovered some music that was meaningful to me that didn't have a trumpet part. And somehow the conducting thing started from there. But the best idea I'd ever had as a teenager was this realization that some person, you know, who walked this earth, who was alive, who had breakfast and had difficulties and everything else like the rest of us, had to go through the trouble of transmitting an idea into notation, so that notation was left for posterity, for someone else to come around and breathe life back into those, you know, those hieroglyphs and bring that music actually into existence in real time. It was just this realization, this light bulb moment. I was about 15 or so, where I realized I needed to go through the process myself personally of coming up with a musical idea, transmitting it to notation, going through that work of editing and so on. And I'm so very grateful that I kind of went through it, because the work as a composer impacts how I'm able to relate to interpreting the work of colleagues, like on this call, or, you know,
Shunting's dissertation piece, right?
Yeah, exactly. Which was like one of another remarkable highlight of that time from Buffalo, being able to be there, you know, where it counts, right? In a recording session for a dissertation, those stakes be high. But what a privilege to be, first of all, you know, trusted as someone who could help, you know, put together an interpretation that would hopefully show up well on recording. And then, as I said, the work in improvisation, which was also such a lively scene in Buffalo. The idea of how through notation we're trying to create something that has elements of aspiration and reaching out for some kind of perfect moment. But in improvisation, especially, you know, without a net, especially free improvisation, we are constantly chasing that miracle. We're constantly trying to make that happen right now in this moment, because we don't know, you know, what the circumstances of the next moment will be. Oh, cool. Yeah, thank you for that. This thing of what is it to...
Is that your training and your musical endeavors seem really symbiotic one with the other, as you were talking about? Like, you are a conductor, but also influenced by being a composer, and that influence. Well, you said that you started as being an interpreter at first, and trumpeter. Like, your training seems very eclectic in a way, but you somehow seem to mash them all together, to mix them in a pretty good balance all around. Because, for example, Megan is kind of like Megan the performer, and Megan the composer, and they well, Megan,
they don't mix that much. I would say,
she can admit to that, like pretty much she has admitted.
I mean, and Ron always said, like, I still play horn very often, but I have definitely a love-hate relationship with it. And I think it actually, a lot of it has to do with the repertoire. To be honest.
Brass repertoire. I mean, there's a lot of cool stuff out there. one of the last
Man.
pieces that Stockhausen ever wrote has horn and 3 tracks from Cosmic Pulses. But
If I woke up like tomorrow with the unbelievable ability to play any string instrument, my horn would go. I'd go throw it in the lake.
Yeah, it's a funny thing that we have as brass players, where there is it can be really satisfying. I mean, even when we're sometimes playing some brass schlock, like when there's a big moment and we just kind of get to put our entire body behind it, there's something kind of wonderful.
The physicality of it is I do like that.
But of course, it's double-edged.
Women hate it too. Yeah.
Yeah. Because the amount of conditioning just to be able to still hear our voice through the other end of the instrument. It's something where for me, it goes back to my undergrad. And I don't mind dropping a name here, because I was at NEC with a bunch of amazing faculty. My teacher, who was really my first composition teacher, made a point to kind of delay his retirement to have me be his last student there. But there was so much going on in terms of cross-pollination with improvisation, with jazz, with third stream and contemporary improvisation, that I kind of from the jump, from my beginning of my academic compositional life, I tried to have church and state, and here's what I'm writing down, and it's this one compositional kind of milieu. But work that I did pretty early on in my undergrad with Joseph Maneri, who's long since passed, but was a microtonal composer and improviser. And being able to kind of stretch to some of the sound worlds that I was being fascinated by, just in my studies, but, didn't have the chops to be able to even get anywhere near as a trumpeter. As a conductor, I'm still quite, I've conducted a lot of Stockhausen at this point, but there's still,
Stockhausen.
The reverence of what it actually requires to bring that music to life. But all of those kind of barriers were proven to be paper thin while at NEC and working with Joe and other improvisers to realize that, that we're stumbling upon sound worlds that otherwise, we might try to create in the lab, in the studio, and then maybe we get them once everything comes together. So that, that work of building on the experience I have wearing one hat, and how it'll end up paying dividends when I have the other hat on, is something that's been there with me for really most of my my professional artistic life.
I
guess. Or no,
yeah.
you.
No, I wanted Shantin to speak about how it felt working with you, because he told me, Shantin, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
Because you told me that you got a really good recording out of Dan's interpretation and that it was very useful. And can you speak about that?
Oh, it was really good. I think the interpretation was spot on, and then
what was the name of your dissertation?
Living Dust for 12 musicians.
Living Dust, yeah.
And the interpretation was spot on, and the dynamic level, the spacing, the elasticity, everything was taken care. And sometimes when we work with conductors, not all of them really interpret the music. Some of them just serve as the time beater. But I could tell Dan really understood the piece, and the interpretation, the recording, very good. And since you mentioned that it was very useful, I sent it over to various opportunities, and It's never disappoints, I would say, because at least it was shortlisted twice for the national submission for the ICM. Unfortunately, it was not it was never programmed in the actual festival, but I couldn't imagine I could enjoy such a success if the conductor was not then, or if I couldn't get such a recording. Yeah, we composers are always very thankful for all the opportunities to work with conductors, and but it is even harder to find a conductor who really interprets the music. Yeah.
It was such a privilege. Thank you. And like I keep returning to how lucky we were to be part of that cohort, because we really were kind of looking over one another's shoulders, as we were at the composition desk. We, got to see not only the aesthetic sound worlds kind of become more vivid, but also we got to see one another defining space and what were important elements in our music, and then even going and taking a left turn. So it was so wonderful getting to be a part of that piece of music, and the spatialization and other things that were a part of that. The fact that we had that beautiful concert hall as an acoustic space to perform in, but also as a really rich backdrop for a studio recording. So that something like the spatialization of those 12 musicians was able to come out. Yeah, it was really a privilege, and thank you for the kind words, because it's I think it's so important that conductors don't conduct music of our times because they're friends with a composer, or because they know that they have to. I think we need to, just like any other performer, we need to have a reason to be performing this work. This wasn't like a bullet point that we agreed we needed to come through, but actually, when we were talking about kind of the breadth and repertoire that I've been lucky to be able to bring into performance, the most important thing for me is actually that act of programming. That we don't just kind of have the one given lunch tray, with the here is a heaping tablespoon of Brahms 4, and then, oh, that's right, in the section for the fruit cup we have a piece of contemporary music, and it could be something by Augusta Reed Thomas, it could be something by one of us, right? Mm-hmm. It should need to be that one piece, and I've been really privileged to be able to come up with programming where, especially when it comes to less familiar works and new works getting, their first or among their first hearings, that the program actually contextualizes for the audience the space in which they can best receive something they're not familiar with. So. Yeah, it's in the context of recording a dissertation, it's just that piece, right? But the idea of being able to get to the heart of what that piece is trying to do, and recording as an interpreter is something a lot different than performing, because performing, we're in a way the beneficiaries of and the victims of the first note, the first tutti, the first articulation, whatever it is, we're going from there. And maybe everything was really, really, really good, and it's one of those performances where we kind of feel the fire under ourselves. And maybe if our psychology isn't too bad, we're not thinking, let's not mess this up, but we're thinking like, yeah, this feels great. But in a recording, there's the danger of things being a little too dry, of just, did we get this good, let's move on to the next thing. An experience I had with my dissertation that we played the last couple minutes of, that was the wonderful James Baker conducting the Sli Sinfonietta. And I remember, we used all the time in that recording session, and we got blocks of everything. We had 2 or 3 times through every single measure. But there happened to have been one amazing run through. There we go again. Sorry. We happen to have one amazing run through, and actually that's the calling card. That's the recording of that piece that I have up, that we played from. And it was
It's like a strong recording, like a very good recording, right?
Oh my God, yeah. Yeah, I was so lucky that it came through. But also when there's a piece that has, the wind at its back, when it really feels like it's telling the story in that same, compelling tone of voice throughout. That's for me the type of recording that I like listening to, where it's you want to come back to it and find more, but it has that freshness as if it's a live performance.
I wanted to say that it seems like to me that you are being a bit humble here, because I remember the first, it was it was your first semester there, and we were taking orchestration with Stadelman, and we had this project where you had to we collaborated with you, and we all had to give you some piece of music, either composed or arranged. And I remember that at first it was hard for the orchestra to do double tonguing and triple tonguing, and to take the orchestra from that and get it towards a place that it could play the cello concerto from Lutoslavsky is a really titanic job, I will say, in a word, in a word. That kind of like speaks about how you are like a sponge for musical scores, I will say, and how you transmit it to the orchestra musicians from the conductor's point of view, like the importance of the conductor's role in all of this. Also, Shontin kind of spoke about this, but yeah, I wanted to say that in that aspect. Like, uh, do you would you say that you do this consciously? You try to do it, or you just work that way?
Well, it's there are a number of things to unpack there. We're talking about on the one hand, some things that are unique to a pedagogical symphonic ensemble, because at the level, these are human beings who've been playing with one another ultimately for years, if not decades. The way in which they know how to breathe, the way in which they know that it's their Brahms 4 and not the next town over's interpretation of it. I love always going back to the word symphonic. When we break it apart, it means together with sounds, and there's something amazingly powerful of a metaphor there. Because in our society we have so many negative metaphors about like the weak link in the chain. But when we put our absolute best, when we know that we've been working on the stuff we need to work on, and our conditioning is good, and we're feeling ready to be there with each moment, everyone in a symphonic ensemble giving close to their 100% gets us into that gym teacher 110% kind of mathematically impossible reality. But everyone who's been part of a symphonic ensemble that's firing on all cylinders knows this phenomenon. So on the one hand, the work is incredibly exacting. Within the realm of so-called, what we call classical music, Western concert music, it's Olympian. We're going for either 10.0 or we didn't quite get there. For the situation like at the university where we had a non-major orchestra, I remember at one point saying to them, you could master the cello, and that's a bit like Sisyphus pushing the boulder up. It's an amazing idea to think about mastering the cello, but one really good thing one piece of good news I have to tell you is we don't have to play everything on the cello perfectly, but we have to play that note right there in this manner. So from a pedagogical standpoint, this is a long roundabout answer to your question. For me, the most helpful thing has been being right at that forefront, being right where an individual is confronted with, how do I bring my voice, which is needed here? How do I hear my voice in it? How do I recognize it as my own? And how do I know exactly what I need to do well here? Because I don't need to do everything the cello could right here. But that one note, it needs a sforzato. It needs to stick out. It needs to have this anguished diminuendo. You know what I mean? Like knowing what the quality that this moment demands from us. Because it's also, this is another little personal thing, but to me, an orchestral tutti is a miracle. You know? 80, 100 geniuses are putting aside whatever happened in their day, you know, the bill to pay, that one thing that didn't work out, all of that goes aside. And
I'm gonna quote you on that.
please, yeah,
Yes.
right? Somehow you get, you know, a dozen, 15 brass people like Meg and myself going, you get a at the back of the orchestra hitting a plastic or calfskin, right? 100 feet away from the concertmaster who's drawing a bow, and somehow it goes da. It's an amazing thing that requires a level of human cooperation.
Yeah, the synchronicity there, like the cooperation, as you say, the being in tune, like literally in tune, like with one another.
In every sense, right? We're talking intonation, but we're talking humanity as well. I mean,
exactly.
Like I said,
That's the way I'm trying to
wonder-
the way I'm using it as. Yeah, definitely. I'm gonna think about that. You're getting to think. That's good.
I mean, I think a lot about like being a brass player adds to that mentality too, because brass players are more limited than like a pianist or a violin in terms of just technique. But what they can do really well is articulation and dynamics and all these like little details. So it's always like, for me, like that I try to focus, like if I feel like I'm not doing those things well, then I'm not, why bother? Like I mean, I might as well not play, because if I'm not doing all those little details really well, then that's what the instrument does really well. So like, yeah, that mentality I can see, like, oh, then kind of holding in onto all the, like, you know, I mean, I say details, but I think they're part of the sound. I think sometimes we think of rhythm and pitches being like the hierarchy. But that can, lead to very flat performances thinking just that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, here is where I stand out a bit as a pedagogue, because I'm talking about directionality. I'm talking about staging dynamics from the first rehearsals, because it's been my experience that if all we're kind of doing is notes and rhythms, there's a hope that at the very end we'll be able to graft the music on. I mean, with this said, if we remember an amazing ensemble from Strasbourg that visited a number of times, Ensemble Linnea, I remember working with them and Jean-Philippe Wirtz and now sadly the late departed Peter Edfisch. And it was actually a piece of Hannah Eimemacher's that we were doing on the first day. And I remember something where I just cut off and I say trombone, if you listen to the bass clarinet, we want to make sure that you're just one level above them. And Jean-Philippe just comes to me and says, Daniel, are they together? and I said, no, it wasn't together this last time. And he says, unless they're together, dynamics don't mean anything. So there are these absolutes where we need to make sure that we're literally on the same page and doing what's necessary so we could start honing in on those finer details. But for me, this, I think, was one of the elements that allowed a group that was not all, music majors where that's their whole world and they're coming to orchestra to expand their horizons and so on. For me, I think it was this kind of simple, quite kind of frank summation for them. That idea, you could master the cello, but that's Sisyphus pushing the boulder. What we need to do is understand what's being called for us to do right here. And for me, that's also the recipe for learning how to play expressively, which at the end of the day, there are all of these built-in self-reinforcing mechanisms. The Duke Ellington quote that is usually quoted in part: if it sounds good and feels good, it is good. That second part is a really important component here. And what I think I understood is if everyone in that orchestra were able to kind of sing it out from within themselves somehow, even if in the practice room it wasn't yet sounding good, they know how it needs to sound. They start kind of embodying that. It starts feeling more natural to do it. And then, it just becomes a lot easier. Then, that kind of sense of I'm walking on eggshells because I'm worried that if this note comes out a little sharp, a little flat, the conductor's going to jump down my throat. That's not the environment that I ever really wanted to cultivate. I think it's easier to play in tune also when we all know where it's going, when we're all breathing together and being a part of that.
So it's about the overall picture then.
Yeah.
That you're trying to portray in a sense.
Yeah. Yeah. That shared goal, right? Because the conductor's the one silent person on stage, so our job really is to make the space that a musician needs to make music even more comfortably than if they were just there by themselves.
And just putting that to words. Yeah.
I was thinking, we talked a lot about
I like your quotes. I like your quotes and your musical thinking, and that makes me think about earlier in Buffalo, like a decade ago, like none of us wrote in the style of another, and how we kind of like what you said, like we kept each other in check, like in those seminars, how we critiqued each other, but also it's like we're like a group of X-Men, of mutants. each one of us had our superpowers and our weaknesses, but we kind of complemented each other. And every time there was a concert, of a student concert, a grad student concert, you didn't know what to expect. It wasn't really a school like at the University at Buffalo, and I really like that.
Interestingly enough, though, when people came in from doing in Buffalo that weren't from Buffalo, they definitely thought that people from Buffalo had a sound. But then if I would ask them, what is that? Because they wouldn't be able to really describe. I don't know if it was a sound. I think it was an energy. That's what I think.
Yeah. Well,
it was an energy of people trying to just kind of discover and create and, and just do things. And,
this is something that's really interesting for me now, working with teenagers. There's an extension of the music theory curriculum that we have, because I teach what previously had been the highest level of music theory that we offer, and now a composition seminar that I was teaching kind of got enfolded into a new higher upper level theory, where you don't necessarily have students who are self-identifying as composers, but we want to get them those skills. And it's my third year at the institution, and we have had a number, come through who really are composers. But to just start those conversations about what is a sound world, what is your sound world, what are the relationships between an aesthetic and a harmonic vocabulary, for example, because I agree that there's something of a polish or an application, or just the seriousness with which we were looking at our materials. things
Mhm.
that really can't be summarized as, oh, we liked major seventh chords, or this one
Mhm.
particular collection, or we tended to overwrite string harmonics. And there wasn't kind of one identifiable sonic object, but that
Yeah.
idea that there were certain kind of aesthetic sensibilities we shared, because in a way our faculty, David Felder, Jeff Stottleman, also Jonathan Goloff
Mhm.
there, um, they they were all kind of preoccupied with getting us past where we were stuck. So it wasn't about getting our voices to sound like theirs. It wasn't about, hey, here's
Mhm.
this one harmonic gambit that works in my music. Now off you go. But it
Yeah.
was this very vigorous, commitment to how we were going to seriously evaluate our materials and use them until we're on to the next idea. And yeah, it was so much fun being at those concerts and those readings as well, because we knew that we didn't know what we were going to hear, but we knew what we were in for, if that makes
Mhm.
sense.
Yeah, and it was always interesting to hear like that other people come and say like, oh, that's like a Buffalo piece, because to me, yeah, I agree with you. Like we have that same kind of energy and strive, but there are many schools and many programs where everyone just sounds like their teachers.
Yeah.
And that was definitely not the case. Like sonically,
I don't
I know
think
I
that anybody
remember
sounded like any of the composers that I showed on
no,
screen. Like David Felder, who sounded like David Felder, who sounded like Jeff Stadelman, who sounded like Jonathan Logolo, who sounded like Cord
no
Littler.
one, yeah.
Really, they wanted us to find our voice. You have been speaking about voice as a conductor, but voice
Yeah.
as a composer, they really, really pushed for us to have our own voice as composers. They that was the most important thing in that program, I would say.
Yeah.
Like the biggest
Mhm.
concern, for sure, for sure. That's why it
Yeah.
wasn't a a school, properly speaking. And that kind of takes me to another question. And Shunting and I kind of were discussing this also with Megan. Like, uh, as a new music composer, we sometimes get to a barrier with the orchestra because we uh, kind of see it as a already established institution, and we don't know if we can implement our own language towards it. Shunting, can you elaborate on that? Have you been working on are you over there taking a break? Okay. But yeah, it's like, what do you think, what are will be some tips like to get that voice from a small ensemble, a solo instrument, into an orchestra as a new music composer?
Yeah, and full disclosure would be that although I grew up in the world of orchestras, I I have in the drawer one piece, and
Okay.
then that dissertation, which is a sinfonietta type small chamber orchestra that accompanies that piano. So like I'm not stating that as a cautionary tale,
Okay.
although it's definitely been part of it. It's been kind of being intimately familiar with how this organism breathes and speaks and does what it does. And also going back to something I said a bit earlier, but an important thing, at least for my compositional world, is that I do have this fairly broad repertoire that I'm performing and studying. My main priority as a composer is to hear something I haven't heard, or to spend time with something that I haven't heard enough of. Um, so if we start just being brutally honest, we could look at examples of composers who wrote a lot for the orchestra and then moved away from it. like Reich and Andriessen, right? And then those composers happen to live long enough that they have all the notoriety in the world, and then all the world's orchestras are coming at them and asking for commissions and are willing to kind of bend over backward by adding different amplified instruments to the orchestra, by leaving out certain sections or other things like that. So denaturing the orchestra has been something, I mean, we could go back to, I believe, right, Roger Sessions' violin concerto doesn't have orchestral violins there. So that's kind of one trick, you know, to denature the sound world of the orchestra. But in the broadest sense, this happened again. Okay. In the broadest sense, what is an orchestra doing really, really, really well? And how far back can we date it? You know, something like the Rite of Spring got comfortably in the repertoire about 50 years after the Rite of Spring was written. If we went back to Lutoslawski, who we were talking about earlier, a favorite quote of his is he had said that he doesn't write for the world premiere; he writes for the 13th performance. So, and I was just speaking with a colleague who plays in the BBC Scottish Symphony, that that unfortunately that composer Lutoslawski, who wrote 4 amazing symphonies and few different really interesting concerti and so on, has really kind of, since he passed, has fallen out of the repertoire, other than one popular piece from the 50s and another, the Concerto for Orchestra, and another equally kind of popular piece from the late 40s, his Paganini variations. So the challenge is going to be, how do we present something to this unique organism that they can approach, but is not just stuck using materials that are at least half a century stale. Kyle Gann and I have actually spoken quite a bit about this kind of frustration for composers who might be writing or might be singularly focused on elements of tuning, of elements of rich polymetric textures, and just knowing that this will not translate, or we would need some impossible amount of rehearsal time and and the best good faith colleagues that we could ever imagine. So I remember in a lesson with Kyle back in my days, my master's at Bard, kind of joking that what you don't want to do is come to an orchestra and say, hey, you actually can't hear each other that well, in terms of intonation, or you actually can't count as well as you think you are. Because also an orchestral groove, the orchestral pocket, is something so personal when we're talking about orchestras at the level, that there are only a few ways in which they're going to go and waltz this waltz. So if we wanted to look kind of at composers of recent times, who don't seem to have issues with this, and here, I don't mind naming some names and kind of just showing some of my preferences and kind of aesthetic preferences, but we have amazing symphonic composers who are still writing for the ensemble, in terms of a Jennifer Higdon, a Joan Tower, a Tanya Leon, and so on. Ways in which we are keeping true to the things the orchestra does really well on its own, but bringing in elements of absolutely contemporary personal harmonic languages, rhythmic profiles, melodic conceptions, and so on. When we're talking about really innovating within the ensemble, then we're coming up to more difficult challenges, because, like I said, you have like a Reich, right? Three movements for orchestra. Was that the name of the piece that was like in the 70s, and then there wasn't anything else until some very, very, very recent large commissions. The question was what he wanted to do musically. There was some limit point where you get an orchestra bigger than this, and it's not going to have that freshness of pocket in terms of the pocket that he was looking for. I saw an amazing concert last year with the LA Phil, and it was Thomas Addis conducting his own music and music of Ravel. And it was the Ravel Left-Hand Concerto and La Valse. And I love his music, Thomas Addis, and I love his writing for the orchestra, both in terms of what the ways in which he gets an orchestra to really be multifaceted and turn on a dime in his operas, to even the chamber symphony, which he wrote at 18 or 19, is an amazing way to get a smaller symphonic ensemble to still kind of have symphonic credentials. So whereas the two pieces of his that were done that I didn't know on that program were amazing to hear, and at Disney Hall there, I was, I got a seat in the choir seating, so I was able to watch him do all of his work. It was actually watching him do Ravel's La Valse, where I understood a little bit better first of all, why he made that program. Harkening back to me saying programming is important, he knocked that one out of the park. But the ways in which he got elements that come apart and then finally articulate back together, I learned more about his music and all of the different ways that he is such a masterful orchestrator at, like, what Michael Gandolfi calls the orchestral sustain pedal. You push down the sostenuto and you get, different lines of things blurring as if a piano with the pedal down. That was an amazing experience. But we do have, composers of our time and the recent past who are actively pushing the envelope with an orchestra. I'd mentioned, the privilege that I had getting to study some contemporary, conducting with Peter Edfesh, but his work, with orchestras going through Do Re Mi, what ended up being his final violin concerto. Those are composers who are lucky to have that privileged position where orchestras are waiting for them to collaborate. For those of us kind of getting in on the ground floor, I think this is the question that we're not quite saying out loud. Do we simplify our compositional aesthetic, our compositional goals and language, so that it works with how the orchestra does best hear one another and does best articulate what it does? Or is there some sort of third? Yeah.
Do you think that that's a given, that one has to be less adventurous? One has to give up a bit of the self, of the individuality of the self, to write for orchestra? And I also want to get Shunting into this conversation because he wrote recently for orchestra. I can say that now.
He
It's
did the
not a
piece.
secret, right, Shunting?
Yeah, I'm here. It's not really a secret. I have been trying to write an orchestral piece for a few years, actually, for various kind of opportunities. And recently, I completed one.
He's
And
the only one brave enough to do this.
and I started that in January, and unfortunately, I restarted the whole process in June, and I completed the whole thing like in early September. Perhaps I will need to borrow your wisdom after our podcast. I think writing for orchestra is very hard. I think at least there is one huge difficulty, because most composers don't really have enough of experience to write for orchestra. And a lot of time when we write an orchestral piece, and that's the opportunity really matters to our career, no matter for our school or for like a future opportunity. So I find it very hard. And when I was writing my piece, I always struggle about whether I should write what I usually write, because my music is usually pretty quiet. And after my graduation from UB, I began to adopt um, a more noise-based style, and I am always afraid of applying the same ideas for orchestral writing. Um, this is the musical struggle when I was trying to complete my latest project for the orchestra. Yeah.
Yeah, I would love to see that score. I'd love to talk shop on that. And what one thing that we can do, and especially if we have composer colleagues watching this who are chewing on kind of the same question, is we can look at it as this kind of difficult choice. Are we going to modulate what we're otherwise doing, what our compositional goals are, our best tricks, do they need to be watered down? If we take things back to that question of the musical goal, of the compositional goal, so we might have one goal that works pretty well as a piece for solo piano. And then we're going on long enough and we realize that it actually expanded a bit beyond. And we needed to have another instrument with a piano or piano trio or something like that. The problem with orchestral composing is we actually start past that line of scrimmage. The goal is kind of already there for us. We're writing an orchestral piece. Like, we might occasionally say this with a string quartet, because they're kind of these signifiers. I'm writing a quartet. Ooh, okay. So they're really, what we're doing is we're talking about the form in some sort of way, not the medium. But when we talk about writing for orchestra, we're really just talking about the medium. And we kind of just like that difficult decision of do we need to dumb down, our rhythm, our tuning, etc., so that it fits with this group. There might be there might be some use here in saying, okay, instead of I'm writing this orchestral piece, I'm cultivating symphonic ideas. Here's something that's going to work for this quintet. Here's something that's going to work for this sinfonietta size piece. But here is the best expression I have of an idea that can be described as symphonic. I'm going to take like a weird pullback by throwing under the bus a legend. Messiaen was not a great orchestral composer. There are great orchestral works by Messiaen, but every single one of them, it's almost like he forgot flute 1, flute 2, flute 3, flute 4, and flute 5. If we're looking at like Eclair sur la, like does not equate the same as violins 1 through 17. He'll always divide up the string section in a way that there's an inherent misbalance, and you don't get this kind of full symphonic sound. You do in a couple movements at Turangalila, but that's practically the very beginning of his symphonic output. So there are ways to still have a novel symphonic expression that actually does break the mold of what is typically good orchestral writing. But what I think the problem that we get into when we do decide to kind of, look off that high diving board and decide that we're going in the water is we'll end up a little while into the process and maybe we're writing in a short score with a lot of notes about where it's going to go, or maybe we're actually writing onto a giant, impossible to track, fully orchestra, all the staves of the full orchestra, and we're going to end up at something where we're reaching into our toolkit, but it's what we would have done with 9 players. It's what we would have done with. And either we need to retool that particular moment so that it matches the symphonic challenge, or put it away, put it into a folder for the next composition, because what's actually being demanded of us here in this orchestral composition is a bit different. It's not a perfect answer to this, because I think that unless we really sit with the problems, we're going to have another generation or two of really, really excellent quality writing for the orchestra that is not all that substantively different from what Lutoslawski was doing in the Concerto for Orchestra, rather than what he was doing in the Third and Fourth Symphony. So also, digging into the rep, I think, is really important. Like, we just lost Wolfgang Riem. Jagden and Forman is like, one of the latter-day symphonies that I think, is a great way that the orchestra has been extended and modernized. Electric bass is in that, and amplified individual strings, but still an amazing symphonic work through and through. As I mentioned with Edfisch, I just think that he knew how to write for the orchestra so brilliantly. Matthias Pincher, another one. Gusty's an interesting one, because Augusta Reed Thomas came and talked to us and gave such professional, remarkable masterclasses, right? She's always the most prepared masterclass giver of all time. And the thing that I almost find frustrating with her music vis-a-vis this one question is Gusty's music is Gusty's music if it's written for 3 people or if it's written for a full orchestra. Her music, I think, has that symphonic quality, whether it's a solo piano composition or her next violin concerto. So there are also symphonic composers, the composers where it's almost more comfortable for them to be writing with that amazing palette and broad brush strokes. I certainly love chamber works of Joan Tower, but Joan Tower works really, really well in big symphonic forms. I'd say Tanya Leon, is also a very similar. I know there was kind of a question brought up when we were sharing some notes about how different countries' kind of symphonic history also plays in here. So I mentioned Addis, and a question of like, it seems like there are a lot of composers from Japan, from mainland China, and from Great Britain, who are writing, and that could be the answer right there, that there is this tradition of symphonic music making. So there's almost more demand for a symphonic composer than a composer who would be writing songs and quartets and so on. I think it could be fun, though, for us to just like kind of open this up a bit and say, like, for posterity on the internet, it's a little dangerous to say things like Messiaen didn't write well for orchestra, even though they're these amazing orchestral pieces by Messiaen. So I'm not asking you guys to potentially put yourself in harm's way like I just was by saying, oh yeah, this is not my
I do it all the time.
But can you think of examples, of writing for an orchestra where it's like, hey, this actually sounds and feels true to our time, and it doesn't make it sound like the orchestra's about to break or about to go on strike?
I think that Shunting will have better examples than I do. Shunting, can you think of examples?
I like Jonathan Harvey.
Yeah.
Jonathan Harvey. I like Akira Nishimura, that he died recently. He seemed like a very symphonic composer, like you. But then again, we're going to Japan. That Takemitsu tradition way. Can you think of any?
I don't know. I mean, part of the problem too is that a lot of composers who are trying to kind of develop any genre write music, which takes a little bit longer to put together because it's not exactly like something the performers has done before. And at least in a lot of the American orchestras, they won't rehearse your piece as much as if you give it to a chamber group would.
Yeah, and that reality of how compressed the rehearsal periods are with an orchestra, and also just what the standards of sight reading are. So when we're talking about composers from the United Kingdom, from Great Britain, sight reading in London is remarkable, and so it's just an interesting kind of brain teaser to think about the first scores of Jonathan Harvey, of Peter Maxwell Davies, of Thomas Edis, etc.
Julian Anderson also comes to mind.
Oh yeah.
He was. I used to listen to his music a lot. A while ago, when I was a grad student, particularly. Yeah.
So I think that those of us as Chunting, in the process of working towards this unique medium within the art form, it's always worth seeing what has been done recently that's good, what's been done recently that's bad, and then to dig in historically a bit. I would actually point to like I'd mentioned Andriessen and Reich as people who wrote for the orchestra and then stopped. I think Glass would be a really interesting kind of foil to look at here, because he just embraced writing symphonically and made the aesthetic concessions in order to do this. So you come up to like Koyaanisqatsi, let's say, and then like look at the type of symphonic writing that's in Einstein on the Beach, and then go just a couple steps further, and all of a sudden the really difficult repeated chunks that work for the Philip Glass ensemble, because they know how to navigate those rapids, right, all of a sudden doesn't work well when translated to especially a purely symphonic orchestra. Because I think Satyagraha and a couple of the other operas do have quite a lot of those big repeated cells. But that Glass actually changed his sound world. And then across however many, dozen plus symphonies that exist at this point, he's then found his sound again through this process of having, created so many symphonic works. Because Stockhausen is very near and dear to my work as an interpreter, and I just recently came from something that was very, very fun. There was in New York, in the Park Avenue Armory, a series of two concerts where 6 hours of music from the operas were projected. And they did it as 2 separate days and then a 6-hour marathon day. And the first thing I was confronted with, besides what I knew, that I knew what this music kind of sounded like in a flat matte, stereo presentation. And now I was going to be, surrounded by 8 channels, 24 speaker array.
You're supposed to listen to them.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then in hearing music from Thursday and hearing music from Friday and hearing music from Wednesday, I'm confronted with the technological change of just what electronic music meant across that time for Stockhausen. And more recently, I've started to think about how there were giant orchestral pieces that he wrote, which completely upended what an orchestral player would have ever expected their life would have been like in an orchestra. And you could go to super early pieces like Punkta. You could obviously Gruppen is denaturing just about everything, because even the notion of the different time scales, well, what's being written polymetrically within some of those bars is already about enough to make an orchestral player say, "I'm taking next week off. I'll see you guys on the Mahler." You know what I mean? But then at the end of his life, Stockhausen comes back to writing for orchestra. He had, in the middle, kind of changed. He even used this term of a modern orchestra, where there are a lot more synthesizers and electronic keyboard instruments creating things that might have taken an entire string section and half a woodwind section to do in a purely acoustic treatment. But then, yeah, looking at the Last Opera, looking at Sunday, which has a scene in it that is played by an orchestra, where at the same time the same music is played by a choir, and 7 times during that scene, channels open up and you get to hear what's going on in the other hall. Stuff where absolutely it's as innovative as everything else he was doing at the time.
That's Donnerstag, right? From
Here I'm talking about Sonntag, the last one that he composed.
Sonntag. Okay, from the 2000s, was it?
Yeah. So that was to 2003.
Okay.
And the scene is called Hochzeiten, the high times or marriages. And it's an incredibly metrically dense piece for 5 displaced ensembles, in 5 different tempi throughout. But the moral of the story there is both the medium, Sonntag, Sunday. Saturday has its own thing with the University of Michigan Wind Ensemble having been written for in the Saturday opera.
My language test was in French. My bad. My bad. I took a bit of Deutsch, but not that much. Okay, Sonntag Ausrich. There you go.
But other composers that we've mentioned, like Pincher and Edfush and so on, where the orchestra is just offering kind of times 10 of what we were otherwise going to achieve in a chamber setting. So, like I said, this isn't an answer that's going to make it easy for anyone listening along to complete their next orchestral piece, but I just hope it actually makes all of us who have kind of hit our head against the wall when just even considering whether or not we want to write for orchestra, to think about the ways in which the orchestra does breathe well together, does hear well across the ensemble. It doesn't mean that there are rhythms we can't write, that there are microtones that can't be heard. It does mean that we should always kind of contextualize the idea with that question, is this a symphonic idea? And if we're constantly answering that question, yes, we're probably creating situations where a seasoned orchestral player is going to know what to do with the lines and dots that we put on the page for them.
Well, I want to play a bit of devil's advocate here and ask Megan. Well, more like a trickster. I want to ask Megan and you, Megan, would you say here it goes. Is orchestral music inherently conservative or more conservative than chamber music? What do you both guys think about this? Because Dan has obviously stated with this last answer and with Stockhausen particularly that you can be very innovative. But then, yeah, Megan?
I think it depends what you mean by inherently, because I think there's nothing about, the collection of people that it should necessarily be, but I think that oftentimes that it just kind of feels like time, if I go down to the Chicago Symphony, if they, when they program a piece of contemporary music, they probably will have 1 or 2 rehearsals on it, and they basically it can't reinvent the wheel, and basically it has to utilize the skills that they're already doing for the Mahler or the Brahms or whatever, the second half is going to be. But that's more of the orchestra as an administrative and just like as a business collective, it doesn't have to do with like the ensemble. Yeah, and it's just hard. And I mean, we came from, a school that, orchestra writing wasn't really pushed, I don't think, on any of us. And in fact, like I remember David Felder. I mean, David Felder is a composer who did write orchestra pieces as a younger composer, and I think his ideas, even in music he had written later, are still very symphonic ideas. But he found ways around not using the orchestra by using these really bigger chamber ensembles and electronics, so he could handpick players and get the rehearsal time. But yeah, I think those kind of ideas maybe kind of got into our heads too, because I think maybe David Felder was more of a symphonic composer than lots of us there, and he wasn't writing for orchestra anymore.
Yeah, there's that, that reality too of the composer. So if Philip Glass kind of just with each successive commission found a path back to the music he was writing before he kind of went symphonic, there's also that aspect of composers whose thinking is quite symphonic, but whose technical means butt it up against the realities of what it's like to be an orchestra. It's funny, something just occurred to me, Megan, while you were talking there. And one, I think it's because of this, the way that you were kind of putting this, is the orchestra inherently as a medium more conservative? Because I was thinking, like, what's more conservative than like a string quartet, right? Like, but it just in terms of kind of like, speaking from cliches, right? But one thing that we're not talking about that I actually think is the really important thing here is a string quartet is going to tour with a certain amount of repertoire. An orchestra might tour, and actually when they tour, that's when they get really good, because they get to play, Thomas Edis's Scylla and Mahler 5, 20 times, across 3 weeks. The problem is that once the quartet says, yeah, we're going to do that piece, they commit in a way that an orchestra never has the luxury to do. A conductor might be committed to a piece, but they're going to do it here and then fly to the next spot and teach the next orchestra the piece, or not teach the next orchestra the piece and just make their way through it. There's the rep that comes in cycles, which maybe that's the reason why it took half a century for the Rite of Spring to get really comfortable, and why it's one of the later outliers. I mean, obviously, orchestras can play the heck out of Rhapsody in Blue, and that was written after the Rite of Spring. But you guys get my point of kind of what has some technical challenges in terms of the way in which it's asking the orchestra to articulate, the way in which it's asking symphonic players to count and hear one another. It's hard to think of things that are absolutely firmly within the repertoire that have, additional bigger challenges. But I can't believe that I haven't really kind of framed it this way. But that reality that if one of the four of us are commissioned by a quartet, we know that quartet is going to have their core pieces they're doing. Maybe they're a quartet that has cultivated an audience to know that they specialize in contemporary music, and it's mostly going to be that. And as far as it goes in this hemisphere, there really aren't orchestras like that. I mean, Boston Modern Orchestra Project in Boston is wonderful. This Lee Sinfonietta, still operating at UB. But, it's very different. And it's not like we have Ensemble Modern or something like that, or a similar analog here in the Americas and in the Western Hemisphere. But as simple as it is, I think if we also read into the kind of psychology of I'm just in this piece for the half hour that we're rehearsing it right now and then the show, and I know within my heart of hearts that I'm never ever going to see it again. That's the relationship that a symphonic musician is going to have to a new piece. Like I said, whereas the chamber musician, they might be inherently equally conservative or even more conservative, but because they actually have to hitch their wagon to the repertoire in a much more personal way than happens with within the symphonic realm. That's a real challenge that I see there. Again, it's not super helpful for us composers, but I hadn't really framed it that way until this conversation now. So thank you guys for that.
Yeah.
No, for sure. Psychologically speaking, if an orchestra or an orchestra player sees something that is reminiscent of the repertoire, he will be more open towards playing it than something that is not orchestral,
Yeah.
you might say, or that has a
Mhm.
bunch of extended techniques, a bunch of different layers of rhythms and stuff like that. Like there will be more resistance, and it implies more rehearsal time and all of that. Yeah, one has to take
Mhm.
all of that into consideration. Like being a composer, where one's at and how much time is the orchestra gonna dedicate to the piece, like versus a string quartet, as you said, that might take the piece on tour and stuff like that. Those are concerns that we all have to deal with if we are writing for those ensembles.
Yeah.
Well, uh, uh, I think that's pretty much a lot of the questions I had for you.
Mhm.
Like, Megan, do you have anything else? Do you or Shantin, do you have anything else you want to ask?
I think I'm good. Yeah.
You're good.
Yeah, I think we
And then,
went through a
do you
lot.
want to say anything?
No, this has been awesome. It's been a really great conversation, and just it reminds me of how lucky we were to each be going at these
I
essential
know.
questions of how do we where are we, how do we locate ourselves within this spectrum called contemporary music. Now I'm just grateful we were able to locate each other here on the on our Hollywood squares, because it still matters, right? I mean, we're still about
Thinking, thinking about art, thinking about this stuff, I think it's very relevant, and it's part of our motors, our inside motors, so to speak, of thinking of what gives us life and kind of like motivates us to do what we do, right? Like that's in great part why this podcast or stream exists in a way. Like uh, it's a necessity to speak about music at this level and to ask these questions, I think. Like, and I thank you very much for coming in and sharing your really big mind with us and your big ideas. Like, yeah, it's been a special episode or stream or conversation. Let's put it that way, conversation. Like, and it took me back.
oh,
Awesome.
likewise. Thank you
Mhm.
so much. This is so much fun. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I guess that's it for today. Well, be safe, people.
Awesome.
Take care.
So good to see you
Bye.
guys. So good to
Oh,
hear your
yeah.
voice.
Is there a way that people can contact you or anything
Oh,
that you want to
Do you have
for
like a website or a
website or
I don't have a website, which I know is just completely
or
ridiculous.
like a YouTube link or wherever you
Yeah.
post it?
Yeah, I guess if we could put up that SoundCloud, that hasn't been updated all that recently, but that way that has compositions, it has some of my improvisation stuff, and then people could shoot a note if they wanted to. Yeah.
okay. Let me put it on screen just so you also have some improvisations as a trumpeter there, right?
Yeah, you actually have two. There's a SoundCloud / Dan Bassin, and there's also one called DB Trumpet, which has even some things with Zane Merritt and TJ Borden on it, going way back. But yeah,
Wow.
if you guys hear anything out there, shoot a note, say hi. Let's open up this conversation beyond. Yeah.
Awesome.
Okay, let me put it on screen just a minute. Uh, there you have
So,
both of Dan's SoundClouds, Dan Bassin and DB Trumpet, and I guess that will be it. Thanks
Awesome.
again, Dan. You've been awesome.
Yeah.
thank you
Thank
guys
you
so
very
much.
much.
So good to see you.
Bye.
Take care.